Okay, so what I want to do today is take a look at, well, pretty much the first three of the available space-time travel communication coordinates in one of the space-time travel communication coordinate systems that we use most often. And these numbers, as many of you know already, are a relationship between observing and communicating, and how that particular arrangement of observation as communication is configured in this particular space-time travel communication coordinate message system is that views is designated as an instance and indicator of observation. So for this particular video, there are three views, and I'm assuming that signifies three observations, and then there's the number nine views, and then there's the number one view. And so there are various ways, and we've described various ways in which we can organize these sets of numbers, but for the purpose of this particular investigation of space-time coordinate communication systems messaging, and for the message that I'm providing in response, or the discourse that I'm providing in response to this sent message, which can in some ways be taken either as a request or as a descriptive communication, or performativity. And so 391 obviously refers to the magazine by Francis Picabia, published in Barcelona, Zurich, and New York between the years I believe 1917 and 1924, and that magazine, of course, was an outgrowth of the Stieglitz magazine 291, which of which Francis Picabia was a regular participant with and in, and so this number 391 is has a history or has a place in the history of the avant-garde, and in the place of modernism, 20th century modernism, and therefore occupies a kind of we would say metaphorical positionality within the discourse of an emergent 20th century aesthetics and anti-aesthetics, to which groups like the Dadaists and the Surrealists belong. And that distinction between a new aesthetics and an anti-aesthetics, I think needs to be addressed, and I will attempt to address it in the communication involved in coordinating this number set. But I also want to take the opportunity to utilize this discussion and this response to this particular space-time communication coordinate message as to address issues involving meta-communication systems, and that would include meta-poetics and perhaps this notion of meta-hermeneutics and meta-aesthetics. Now, one of the ways that we'll address this idea of meta in this discussion is of this term 391 is we'll attempt to push the boundaries of our understanding, I guess, of what meta means, and move it beyond merely self-reflective message systems. In other words, you could say there's a sort of standard understanding of what meta means in meta literary in a recognition of meta, the meta arts. A poem meta-poetic poem could easily be identified as a poem concerning poetry, right? And meta in that sense is merely self-reflective. But what I want to argue is that there's a more profound sense of what meta can mean, and that is that it can be something that is not only about itself in a certain way, so a meta-poetics being, about itself, but a meta-communication system, including meta-poetics, would be a system that actively evolves and transforms itself in relationships to messages that it both receives and messages that it sends. In other words, the message system itself creates changes and responses, and in much the same ways that a living organism or a community of organisms develop and change and transform and create systems both within themselves and beyond themselves, that a meta communicative system, whether literary or artistic or merely poetic or trans-poetic, and all of these terms, trans and extra and intra, without splitting hairs, concerning all of the ways that that these modifiers that we use to create more complex understandings of simple systems, inform one another. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to just stick with this single modifier, meta, at least for the most part, and then if there's any need or obvious moment in which a term like extra or intra or trans or whatever else might need to come in, then we can do that. We can bring those terms in at that time. But basically, what I want to focus on is a way a communicative system can evolve, in both in relationship to its interior sets, the parts of which it through which it works and elaborates itself, and externally through messages that come into the system, like this one, for example, 391. So we'll look at that, and I'll play. While we're doing that, I'll play this piece, which follows the three designators, 3, 9, and 1, and there's a reason that I want to play this piece, and I'm going to have Aaron read a selection from this article, Waggle, in the background while I visually play that video. And so we're going to combine the visual imagery of that video, but I'm gonna mute the sound, and the sound now is going to be Aaron reading this article written by David Gilley and Karina Tom, and it concerns these pheromones that are emitted by honeybees when they're doing the waggle dance, and what the function might be in communication systems for these pheromones and odors, and in the role of the communication system that involves foraging for the honeybee, and the location and locating these flowers, the waggle dance is one of the dances that bees use in communication systems, and we've already presented a brief introduction to the way that works. And it is a communication system. And so, in talking about communication systems, which we're doing, today, and introducing this new information on the Waggle dance, I'm trying to move the direction of the discussion towards, a meta-communicative understanding of communication systems. And because I want to focus on the transformative nature of these communication systems as an aspect of what that meta means, I'm going to begin, but not complete, a process of reorganizing one of our communication systems. So this is over here on this side. So let's try to keep in mind what all of the things that are going to be going on. Aaron's going to be reading this text in the background while we watch this video, and then I'll probably have to repeat this several times. And we're moving towards a comprehension and description of the way that we're going to alter and modify this space-time travel communication coordinate message system, and we're going to do it in relationship to this number, but not in an obvious sense. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Picabia and aesthetics and the evolution of aesthetics as opposed to anti-aesthetics, and I'm going to try to relate that idea, which is one idea can be isolated in a certain sense and probably not in another sense, from the modifications that we're going to provide here. And if I have everyone recall, one of the ways that we keep track of these numbers is that if I bring this this Mac playlist up to the top here, and I position the first space-time travel communication coordinate number at the top, you'll recall that that gives us 40 units to the bottom. So it's easier to count these off. And I'll count off here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. So in this first playlist, which in a certain trivial way could be recognized as a kind of meta playlist set or meta set of playlists in which multiple playlists are included in the first 32, right, of these designators that are smart playlists. So in a certain trivial sense, smart playlists are meta playlists that include multiple playlists, or we could at least say that they're complex sets of space-time travel communication coordinates, and there are 32 of those. And what I'd like to do, but not today, in the transformation of this communication system, which you recall again is a response to this number, and the and the way that I want to move this number towards an understanding of what meta means in the expression meta-poetic or meta-communicative, and to move that understanding away from a simple understanding of being about itself or self-reflective or an awareness of one's ability in acts of communication to call attention to the elements of communication itself, which in some ways is what poetry always does in the forms and the forms that poetry takes on, and the restrictions, right, that it utilizes in its system of communication. So in a sense, every sonnet is already meta-communicative, because not only does it carry a message, but its form, reflects something of additional, value or of additional significance to the message that it's sending. So, for example, and it does this in ways that are restrictive to the genres and forms that it utilizes, but also creatively additive and supplementary. For example, nothing tells William Shakespeare in a particular sonnet that he has to use, consonants or assonants in these lines, but the consonants and assonants that he uses in lines, 1, 3, 5, and 7, may or may not, but may reflect something additional about the content, right? If he's talking about sound and he has all of this sound going on, it obviously is reinforcing something, regarding that particular message. And so when we talk about, form and poetics, and forms, we can never really be talking merely about what sonnets do in general, but we need to talk about what, for example, this sonnet does in particular, and whether that's an outgrowth of its relationship to itself as sonnet, or the development of a new relationship, say to some other form, right? And so that operation is always already more complicated than a simple version of what meta means, because you have different types of relationships established with an outside inside, and generic constraints, the generic constraints of sonnet, versus the expectations of supplementation that belong to this notion of aesthetic form as an evolving and creative process, right? Okay, so all of that, and also the mere designation of form as constraint, versus structure. And sometimes it's not clear, which is which. Is this a constraint or a structure? But the one could say, formal dialectic of what I would call like open structure, which is and by open, I mean building process, like the way that one would dance, or that one would construct an object, versus closed constraint. And closed constraint has more to do with like, say that you were using an architectural metaphor, right? And you're building a house. Well, one of your closed constraints is that it has to stand up, right? So if you're an engineer, you understand that it has to fall under certain rules, and there will be load bearing walls, and there will be other walls, and there will be one will have, if you want running water, that's another constraint, right? So closed constraints can be seen as differently from what I would call open form. And open form is largely the domain of an aesthetics, right? So when Gaudi makes these interesting moves in his architecture, they're not constraints; they're open form, and they don't belong to the necessity of load bearing walls. They belong to this evolution of this creative imagination, and are in that sense, in somewhat similar to the way that Shakespeare might use assonance or consonants in a certain line in a certain poem in relationship to content, and probably more analogous to that than the way that all of the sonnets in one way or another are constrained by this necessity of rhyme, and by this necessity of a certain number of lines and couplet at the end, and et cetera, right? Okay, so all of that going on in a distinction between open form and closed constraint, and then and perhaps how it relates to this idea of aesthetics versus anti-aesthetics. The need to to talk about, or the desire at least, to talk about that in relationship to an ongoing process of an evolving communication system as meta-communicative, rather than merely a self-reflective. And so coming back to this image, 32 units in this first set that in some ways is a more complicated set than the set that begins with this space-time travel communication coordinate for non-blondes, which is a single unit set, right? And what I'd like to do in the modification of this system is, and as I said, not today, but eventually, extend the first complex set all the way down to the unit at the bottom. In other words, make this first set, which is now 32 units, 40 units. And then I'd like to make the second set, which is now 340 units, beginning with 4 non-blondes, and ending with this album by Zakir Hussain, 340 units. I would like to extend the first set to 40, which is now 32, and the second set, which is now 340 to 360. And the reason that I want to do that, and the reason that transformation itself is meta-communicative and in a sense meta-poetic, is because this number 391, which of course is a reference to the magazine 391 that Francis Picabia published in Zurich, Barcelona, and New York between 1917 and 1924, an obvious reference to that, but it reminded me of the fact that the Waggle dance that has become newly incorporated in our performance aesthetics as a performativity, and specifically related to the metaphor of bees, a swarm of bees dancing in high court. And of course, what these bees are dancing against, or dancing or dancing for, is the removal of and to frighten off these agents that are harming their hive, or that they perceive, right, as in observe, as destructive to their collective existence. And of course, these figures up here represent the threatening agents, and the bees are using all of their natural abilities, to communicate in these very specific ways, and their natural defense systems to defend themselves against these intruding agents, right? So that's going on, and that's been incorporated into our understanding of how space-time travel coordinate communication systems work. And the term that I'm using for that, even though there are two terms for there are two different dances that honeybees actually perform. There's a round dance, and there's a waggle dance. And I'm leaving for the moment the waggle dance in abeyance. I'm leaving it for. I said it just the opposite of what I intended. I'm leaving for the moment the round dance in abeyance, and I can never recall whether it's the round dance or the circle dance. And the round dance would relate it, to certain kinds of human dances and human communications, and circle would take it elsewhere. And I can never remember whether it's it's the one or the other, but I think it is the round dance. And I'm leaving the round dance, in abeyance for the time being, and focusing on these performativities as engagements of the Waggle dance, and so that's a metaphor for a part of a communication system, and we're trying to the best of our ability to integrate that message and metaphor of Waggle dance as both a political performativity and as a communication system into all of the communication systems that are currently available on this particular channel of communications, and the metaphors for those channels are various and include the rail, which is a metaphor that relates it back to systems of cryptic encoding that include the Underground Railroad and other forms of for one reason or another, hidden communication and coded communication systems, and then this system, which operates under a kind of in a certain sense, one-to-one correspondence model, but that relates it in time to an evolution of an understanding of what both channel and contact would mean in communication systems, and so it's an evolution in a certain sense of Jakobson's idea on messaging systems, and certainly very much what I would call a post-structuralist rendering of communication systems, at least insofar as it occupies and addresses issues that involve the following problems that are basically ignored or elided in both structuralist and post-structuralist discourses. And the first of those is simple. It's called time, and involves elements of units of time and segments of time, as well as durations, and that involves like a whole set of understanding that proceeds from this idea of an event horizon and beyond that. And then, and that evolves, in different ways from, T zeros and from, and from another aspect of time, which is the segmentation of it, and Cage addresses that. John Cage addresses that minimally in his work, but we try to address it more maximally here, in the way that time can be organized in relationship to designated abstract units that divide, actual phenomenal and phenomenological units. All right, so that's one set. And then another set is, of course, the one that we've already been referring to, observation as communication. And that's a new set that, post-structuralism and structuralism failed to account for, and Jakobson, if you think of Jakobson as outside of either one of those operations of post-structuralism or structuralism, failed to account for as well. And then finally, this idea of indeterminacy versus determinacy. Okay, so. And how that got, and how we failed really to account for that in message communication systems too. All right, and where that lies is, okay, so observation is communication, right? Time as part of the coordinated materiality of contact channel relations, and then this other notion of indeterminacy, which again, figures like Duchamp and Cage and Cunningham and Jackson McClough take up in a certain way, but not as a physics or metaphysics as they are here. And what I mean by that is for why it's never taken up as metaphysics in McClough is that McClough assumes that there is such a thing as chance, right? And so it doesn't really enter into the discussion of a metapoetics, and it can't, because as chance, and it's locked in this realm that, you know, the aleatory or whatever one might designate it as. It's not an intentionality, but we bring it in to the communication system as an aspect of intentionality by recognizing its indeterminacy. And let me explain that in relationship to this number, okay? So is this number accidental or intentional? Okay, this is what makes it, this is what brings it into the metadynamics of the communicative system as a communication system. So the metadynamics of a communication system as a communication system, right? Rather than a chance operation. Was it an accident that 3 people watched the first video, 9 people watched the second video, and 1 person watched the third video? Or is it a message? In other words, was this number intended, or is this number, you know, the result of accident? And in our system, we are going to take it, you know, as a message. So we are taking it as a communicative act, whether or not it was intended as such. And intentionality is figured in, but, you know, provided with various options of interpretation, right? So we can regard the obvious option, or we can fail to remember the number 391 belongs to Picabia, and we can merely read it as, let's say we take it otherwise, and we'll go to the first set, right? So let's go to the first set, and the number, well, we know that there are 32 units in the first set. So we generally don't repeat the first set as a loop, but you could, and that would give us 7. And so so this is 5, 6, 7. So I'm taking 39 and I'm subtracting 32 from it, and I've got 7 because I'm using this first set as a loop, which I don't usually do, but we're being experimental today, I guess. And then we'll just use this number 1 as the interior designator, and we could arrive at Silver Springs, right? And that could be a message. Or we could take the 391 and use it in the second set. And if we use it in the second set, which begins with 4 non-blondes and has 340 units in it, we'll go to 51. So here's 40, and then we have to count out 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then we'll have to see what's behind door number 4, and behind door number 4 is another 1. Door number 4 is what we're going to use as the visual background once we really get started here, and that gives us this unit, both by doing and by being undone, from the playlist Visions and Dreams of Chiron and Pisces. All right, so that we could use this message that way, and we could discount, you know, the fact that we've talked about the evolution of 291 already on this channel, and so 391, which is you know, the first step, or, you know, development in the stages of the evolution of the use of this number as a magazine, I suppose. We could ignore that, but ignoring it, you know, and ignoring, you know, a memory and as significant a number as what 391 represents, in some ways would be to, again, you know, sort of either ignore or evade or elide or disavow the complexity of this type of communication system, which we don't intend to do, right? So this need to come back to that number, and this is the Wikipedia entry on 391, and what I want to focus on is a single quote here. But we're now ready, having gone through that introduction, at least to. I guess we're not, because I'm going to need to introduce this quote first, and then we can move on to the visualization. But one of the things that Picabia's 391 also reminded me of was his statement on this project's relationship to this history of aesthetics as a kind of disavowal, in a certain sense, of the role of the aesthetic in this post-aesthetic project, and I want to bring it in here because we've already discussed in a certain way. We've discussed Lyotard's Francois Lyotard's take on what the postmodern represents, and he claims that it represents a shift from a focus on the beautiful to a focus on the sublime. And of course, one of the models that he utilizes for that is Barnett Newman. And we've already talked about Barnett Newman, and we've talked about why Barnett Newman is sublime. And we've talked about why he's sublime in a socio-political context that, if I remember correctly, and I may be wrong, but that Lyotard, largely ignores. And we've sort of recovered that social political context and reestablished it in our understanding of the work of Barnett Newman, and how the sublime in his work is much more encompassing than Lyotard even recognizes it as, and its interrogation of annihilation and human destruction and its regard of the eternal is almost overwhelming, and in fact if you really understand what's going on, almost unapproachable, and we've used the famous observation by Adorno to help us understand that work. After the Holocaust, poetry is impossible, and so we've critiqued Lyotard, both in terms of the limitations that his strictly Kantian reading of Barnett Newman entails, and we've critiqued the fact that he largely ignores in his formulation the role of the charming, which is an aesthetic kind of middle term identified by Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Judgment, and that often goes overlooked in discussions of aesthetics. And we've critiqued that, and we've looked at, or at least hinted at, that Gertrude Stein, if one is going to still utilize the category of aesthetics to describe the work of figures like Gertrude Stein that are interested in process and transformation and evolution and this kind of phenomenology as metapoetics, that a much better choice than the beautiful or the sublime would be the charming. And so rather than say, like, in terms of aesthetics, that modernism and postmodernism move away from the beautiful and toward the sublime, I would say that there are a number of movements, and one may include, in the case of Barnett Newman, certainly there's an aspect of the sublime and the aesthetic that's maintained, but there's a movement in general away from accepted values in aesthetics and toward new formations. And for Stein, that may be very well represented in the charming, if we still think of Stein as primarily a writer of a kind of traditional literary work that can be seen as modeled on a pleasurable experience of the representational, right? And in that sense, aesthetic. Whereas once you get to like someone like Duchamp and or Picabia, it's hard to think of them in any other terms than semiotic. And if you wanted to distinguish between the semiotic and the aesthetic, you could say that, well, in Gertrude Stein, you still have the pleasures, in a certain sense, the aesthetic pleasures of the text, but they're modified by a phenomenological investigation of semantics and awareness, without splitting too many hairs, but by the time that you get to Picabia, I mean, you can say that there's a certain kind of aesthetics in the formal design of this figure, but it's hard not to notice that there's this intentional irony, right, that is also at play, that this aestheticized mechanical object or materiality, whatever it is, that looks very much like a patent design, right? But it's clearly aestheticized. But it also looks like a skull or like Georgia O'Keeffe's some of Georgia O'Keeffe's found deer and horse and cattle skulls, that for Georgia O'Keeffe, the aesthetic component is still there, but in Picabia there's this irony, this like profound irony that plays in the resolutely irreconcilable nature of the thing as signifier and semiotic sign, and the thing as modified design aesthetic and its simplicity, and that irony really challenges the notion of whether these types of art can still fit neatly and tidily into aesthetic categories at all. And Picabia is certainly like self-conscious of this and aware of it, because the terms that he utilizes to discuss the project of 391 are not aesthetic but anti-aesthetic, right? And so he doesn't say that I wanted to move away from the beautiful and toward the sublime. It's rather that he's kept, in a certain sense, the elegance of the beautiful in the design quality that he adds to this, whatever it is, but it reminds us of a xylophone or an ancient Greek harp or a skull, or all of these very evocative and connotatively evocative image, but it has this beautiful design quality and this kind of wonderful palette, right? This palette of browns and whites and blacks, and with hints of silver and gray, and hints of shading, and the relationship between the figure and the age-worn page that it exists on. It's only made it in a certain way more beautiful over time, and the shadows and the created by the texture of the page, and all of that going on. And yet, like standing here and laughing at us, clearly at the same time as both faciality and its relationship to the skeletal structure, but also the hint of this figural representation of some human-like form with his his or her arms raised and touching his ears or her ears or situated in this strange quasi anthropomorphic mechanical representation. And his statement here says a lot about what he's working toward. Every page must explode, whether through seriousness, profundity, turbulence, nausea, the new, the eternal, annihilating nonsense, enthusiasm for principles, or the way it is printed. Art must be unaesthetic in the extreme, useless, and impossible to justify. So this is the anti-aesthetic right here. And as I said, it's not always possible, to say that one is one thing only. The moves that Stein makes are clearly, semiotic, grammatical, and phenomenological, but that doesn't discount the fact that her playfulness is also still very clearly participates in aesthetic values, and it has rhythms, and it has both dissonant and harmonic sounds and phonics, and it has a play of syntax that very much like Picasso's cubism is compositional. And composition we tend to think of as an aesthetic characteristic. Now the closer that it approaches to the closer that it approaches an actual mathematical or grammatical model of either set theory or units of expanding evolution, as in a serial set, that and that idea belongs to seriality belongs still to an aesthetic model if it's reincorporated in visual display in a manner, right, that is either perceivable as compositional beauty or overwhelming, right, as in a seriality that say a seriality that represents the number phi, but not in a way that's entirely perceivable, can still represent the sublime. But as it approaches these models, it also absorbs the ability to communicate in modes that were previously unavailable, and hence that it not only expands what the aesthetic might be, as in Lyotard's understanding of Barnett Newman, but it can also violate or explode those ideas, as in Picabia's notion of moving beyond the aesthetic and into the extreme, the useless, the impossible to justify, or into a post-Einsteinian universe, as is represented in the space-time coordinate, space-time communication, space-time travel coordinate communication system that recognizes observation as communication, indeterminacy as is represented in whether the number 3 is an intentionality or an aleatory phenomenon, and duration itself. How long will this number 391 exist? In terms of our model of communication, and what role does that duration have in our understanding of communication? In other words, if I click on this to remind myself of something that goes on in this piece that may relate to the number 391, I already changed this value, right? And then that period in which this number existed as 391 is no longer available to us. So I'm going to avoid doing that now, but I don't mind clicking on this one. So we're going to click on this one, and that'll be our visual background, as I have promised. And Aaron is going to read from this article. And you'll recall that the reason that we're increasing the values over here is because I want to incorporate this system into the metaphor of the Waggle dance. And one of the main ways that I want to do this is by increasing this second set within this space-time travel communication coordinate set. So there's two sets, right? There's the set that goes up to 32, the complex set, and then there's the set that goes up to 340, the simpler set. And I want to increase the number of the set that goes up to 340 to 360. And the reason that I want to do it is because the Waggle dance involves the movement of a honeybee in the act of communicating with other honeybees, and that movement depends on the angle that bee dances in relationship to the position of the sun. And the position of the sun and the angle that the bee dances inform the other bees that who that bee is communicating with, where the source of flowers are for foraging, right? So, and the length of the dance, which we won't be involved in changing in relationship to space-time travel communication and coordinate systems, at least today, is what determines the distance, all right? So that the direction is determined by a relationship of the angle of the dance to the angle of the sun that the perceiving bees are perceiving in the dance, and that is a direction or directionality or vector that the bees then utilize to determine where to find these particular flowers. And in order to bring that dance into this system, we require 360 units as opposed to 340 units because there are 360 degrees in a circle, correct? All right, so 360 minus 340 is 20. That means that we need to add 20 units to the second set and increase the 340 to 360. And in the first set, I'm not sure what I want to do with the first set yet. I may exclude it from the necessary characteristics of the Waggle dance and bring it all the way down to it'd be a lot easier mathematically and to work with the numbers if I bring it all the way down to 40 instead of 36, and then having to work with the division by 10. And so we may add 8 units to the first set, but we can worry about that later. The first part of the operation that I want to perform, again, that is growing out of an understanding of this number, because 391, right? 391 reminded me in our system, because in our system we transform all 9s into 6s and all 6s into 9s in honor of Jimi Hendrix, if 6 was 9 and if 9 saw 6. So this unit 391 becomes, in our transformative grammar involving if 6 was 9, 361. And that 361 reminded me of 360 degrees that brings us back to 0, but it also reminded me of the way that space-time travel communication systems work in that since we have the 1 in the 361, it takes us back, right? Because this is a circular or a loop, not a repeated segmentation, takes us back. So the number 361 is both exceeds, the circle, but brings us back to the first unit in the circle, which is 4 non-blondes. And that, of course, had recently, not now. Now we have Lisa Gerard at the top, but 4 non-blondes had recently been configured at the top of the page here. So that reference in 391 as 361 is metapoietic in at least 2 senses, right? It's metapoietic in the fact that it recalls and remembers that 391 is in fact 361 in the if 6 was 9 system that we've included as part of the way that we read these. Okay, so let me clarify that. So if I receive a number 9 down here, I automatically translate it into a 6. So this is the way that 9 is represented. This is the way that 1 is represented, and 9 goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Rather than 9, right? All 9s are represented as 6s, and all 6s are represented as 9s. And that's part of the communication system. And that was, again, a modification, made in the system based on a communicative message. And in that sense, again, we're talking about a metapoetics that exceeds the notion of being about itself and becomes self-transforming in relationship to both the memory of what belongs to the system as inside and interactions with that system that belong to memory sets included, in all of the different relationships between interpreter and communicator, or say sender and receiver, and those simple subsets, sender and receiver, become complicated in and of themselves by the transformative nature of the system, right? So indeterminacies can exist within the system, such as, ghosts in the machine, and algorithms can exist in the system as both communicative and interpretive, right? Which is something that, doesn't belong to understandings that fall within, structuralism, post-structuralism, or whatever, Jakobson was doing in his version of Russian formalism. All right, so that, this number 391 reminded me of 361, reminded me of the 360 degrees that we need to create message systems out of the metaphor of the Waggle dance, and it reminded me of and that was one metacommunicative expression and interpretation within the number, and the second was of course this one, the fact that we had a 4 non-blonde song up, recently, and that song specifically was this one, and that was replaced recently for various reasons with various degrees of complexity. With this image and with this tune that accompanies it in this piece called Demeter Dreams of Her Daughter's Delicate Draftswomanship. All right. Okay. So all of that is the inspiration for a change in the space-time travel communication coordinate system, and this change, won't happen, immediately, but that's the plan for the change that responds to this number set that we have today, which I'm taking as a suggestion that in order to incorporate the Waggle dance more clearly and more accurately into our designated space-time travel communication coordinate set that involves the Apple playlist, that we need to, minimally, we need to add 20 units to our 340 units and represent, so each one of these units will now represent a degree in our ability to perform the Waggle dance. And so, having this situated at the top of the page, and I thought that the first edition that I would add, I don't know if we'll be able to see this or not, is and for various reasons I want to add this as well. But this is Sinead O'Connor, Universal Mother, and I don't have the CD case for this. This is a different CD case. This belongs to this case belongs to a record called Faith and Courage. But when I bought the record inside, I bought it from a used some kind of a used item store. Could be Goodwill, could be something else. But I don't know. I may have opened it up and I didn't have a copy of either one of these CDs. So I was happy to get this one, even though I would have also been happy to get this one. So there's a disparity between the packaging here and the and what it holds. This is not Faith and Courage, but certainly Sinead O'Connor, insofar as I'm concerned, always occupies a position of faith and courage, and certainly in the struggle against patriarchal oppressors like these folks, she's always occupied a place of faith and courage. So I like the idea that the faith and courage and the Universal Mother are not certainly not synonymous, but that these terms complement one another in the way that I want to utilize her work here. And all right, so now after we've exceeded we've really exceeded our ability to get in time. We've exceeded an hour, and so we've exceeded our ability to get this on the web in a simple and easy way. But I had promised that I would
bees and beekeepers share many things, including the incessant drive to find food and eat it, behavior referred to as foraging. Human and bee foraging has been intertwined by agriculture into a tight mutualistic relationship, the success of which depends on deep knowledge of our partner's biology and behavior, much like certain human-human relationships. The scientific method has been of great help here and continues to reveal amazing details of honeybee foraging behavior. The following is a story of some recent discoveries we have made about how bees communicate with each other to coordinate colony foraging. It probably will not change the way you work your bees this afternoon, but any detail of bee behavior could someday become relevant for beekeeping practice. And I think it will appeal to the curious biologist that I know is part of every beekeeper, knowing all the remarkable ability of honeybee colonies to discover and use food sources lies at the heart of what makes them successful across the world and useful to us as beekeepers. We know much about how bees achieve these amazing feats from the science of Carl von Frisch, Martin Lindauer, Tom Seeley, and many others. See von Frisch 1967, Lindauer 1971, and Seeley 1995. We know that the collective brain behind a honeybee colony's foraging success is the waggle dance performed by successful foragers to communicate to potential recruits the location of a profitable food source. We know that waggle dance recruitment functions within a web of communication, involving close coordination between active foragers and other task groups such as food storage bees and unemployed forager bees. We understand this dance signal to be a language which can be decoded to convert symbolic movement into real-world distances and directions, that this language has dialects, and that it can be modified to indicate food sources that are very near or very high quality. We know something about the way in which information is transferred from dancers to dance followers, and we understand that there are elements to food signaling beyond the dance language, such as transfer of food odors. We know more than can be nutshelled here, but do we know everything? Recent experiments by teams of students and scientists such as myself suggest a new dimension to the communication process by which honeybees recruit nest mates to food sources. The identity of this new dimension: bee body odor. Discovering a new smell while I was working as a postdoctoral researcher at the USDA Honeybee Research Lab in Tucson, Arizona, I received a visit from two honeybee biologists of the German tradition, Dr. Harold Netsch of the University of Notre Dame, and Dr. Corinna Tom of the University of Arizona. We at the Tucson lab were at the time working on the problem of queen volatile chemicals, and how these might relate to queen supersedure and Africanization of European bee colonies. Gilly et al., 2006. For this work we were refining a technique of chemical sampling called solid phase microextraction, SPME, in which volatile chemicals are absorbed onto a coated fiber, separated into individual compounds by gas chromatography, and identified by mass spectroscopy. This technique is more commonly used for detecting volatiles in organic liquids such as wine or from contaminated water, but also allows for non-destructive sampling from live organisms such as bees. Figure 1. Figure 1. A live queen, in flask, is sampled for volatile compound emissions using a SPME fiber. The fiber is protected by a wire mesh guard during sampling. Inset. Diagram of a SPME fiber. DRS. Tom and Netsch were both impressed with the technique, wondering if it could be used to tap into the food communication system on which they had both done research in the past. Some of their past work suggested that colonies could be stimulated to forage by exposure to air piped in from an actively foraging colony. Tom and Dornhaus, 2004. We decided to try our luck to see whether SPME samples we took of the air on the dance floor area of observation hives would reveal obvious chemical signals beyond the abundant odor, noise present throughout the hive. To our scientifically tempered delight, 4 compounds revealed themselves in samples from the dance floor, but not from other areas of the hive, nor from the dance floor at night, when foraging is shut down. Documenting the phenomenon, could the compounds detected on active dance floors be chemical messages produced by forager bees? An alternative idea that would need to be addressed with evidence is that the compounds were odors from flowered petals or from fresh nectar brought back to the hive by the foraging bees. To determine the source of these compounds, we marked bees arriving at an unscented food source and then took SPME samples of both marked foragers and unmarked non-foragers. Figure 2. The outcome was that the compounds were present in samples from marked foragers, but at high levels only from those marked foragers that waggle danced. We therefore dubbed these the waggle dance compounds. Tom et al., 2007. Figure 2. Experiment to determine the source of dance floor compounds. After being trained to the feeder dish, bees arriving at the dish were marked with paint so that they could be identified when they returned to the hive. SPME samples of marked bees showed high compound levels only from waggle dancing bees. Now that we knew that something interesting and undocumented was going on, we recruited help from our chemist, Dr. Judith Hooper, who identified the waggle dance compounds as long-chain hydrocarbons. These 4 hydrocarbons are known to be present on honeybee body surfaces, Blomqvist et al. 1980, and are known pheromones in other insects such as wasps, Steinmetz 2003, and flies, Howard et al. 2003. Getting the biology right, do the Waggle dance compounds function as a honeybee foraging pheromone? Answering this would require demonstration that the dance compounds modify bee foraging behavior. Happily, most of the compounds are available for purchase commercially, so we were able to produce a mixture that mimicked natural compound levels and inject it into a hive to see if bee behavior changed as a result of exposure. Figure 3. Figure 3. Experiment to determine whether dance compounds affect foraging behavior. The compound mixture was injected into heated tubing through which it was blown by a fan onto the dance floor area of the observation hive. Heat was adjusted so outflowing air matched normal beehive temperature. Foraging behavior was measured by monitoring bee arrivals at a feeder dish. This kind of manipulative experiment, including an unmanipulated control group for comparison, is critical in science for establishing cause and effect relationships. We predicted that exposure to the dance compound mixture would boost the number of bees arriving at a food source as compared to a control substance, here the mixture's solvent alone. Results showed that the dance compounds nearly doubled the number of bees arriving at the food source in comparison with the control. Figure 4. This suggests that the dance compounds, released by Waggle dancing bees, functioned as a colony foraging stimulant. Gilly et al. 2012. Figure 4. Results of experiment to determine whether dance compounds affect foraging behavior. Bee arrivals at the feeder dish were recorded for 10 minutes before the dance compound mixture was injected, and for 30 minutes afterward. In half of the trials, the pure solvent of the mixture was injected as a control. Each bar represents the mean number of arrivals from 15 trials, normalized among trials to account for daily fluctuations in foraging conditions. Redrawn from Gilly et al. 2012. From colony to individual, how do the Waggle dance compounds affect the behavior of individual bees to produce this colony-level stimulatory effect? We thought the dance compounds might attract dance followers, who are potential recruits, and or increase each dance follower's willingness to become a recruit, i.e., to pursue the food source being advertised by the dance. To test this, we marked a pool of forager bees for individual identification, figure 5, so that we could record the effects of dance compound exposure on individual behavior. Figure 5. Bees marked for individual identification drinking from a feeder dish. Identification of individuals was critical for experiments to understand the behavioral mechanisms by which the dance compounds stimulate colony foraging. Insets. William Patterson University undergraduate Corey Stein marks bees at a feeder, our state-of-the-art bee marking technology. We predicted that dance compound exposure would increase both the number of dance followers and the recruitment success of each dance, as measured from video records of the observation hive dance floor. Data from 2 field seasons, however, did not support either of these predictions. There were no significant differences in the efficacy of Waggle dances when bees were exposed to the dance compound mixture, Gilly 2014. After a brief mourning period for the death of our beloved idea, we moved to the next, most likely hypothesis. Considering alternatives, if the Waggle dance compounds are not stimulating foraging by amplifying the message of the Waggle dance to potential recruits, then who is the target recipient of the dance compounds? Well known by those who have watched foraging bees in detail is that experienced foragers sometimes bypass dance following altogether, instead using their private memory information to pinpoint former food sources. Beismeider and Seeley 2005, Gruder and Farina 2009. This phenomenon is known as forager reactivation. We hypothesized that the dance compounds might reactivate foragers to visit food sources with which they had previous experience. If this hypothesis is true, then exposure to the dance compounds should still stimulate foraging flights even when the feeder is empty to halt recruitment to the feeder via dancing. The experiment we conducted to test this was again similar to the previous experiment in setup, but now the feeder was emptied after the bees had been trained to it, and the behavioral response we measured was the number of experienced, marked foragers arriving at the empty feeder dish after one season of defeat at the hands of unusually wet weather. Data from the second season revealed a reliable increase in feeder visits by experienced bees following dance compound exposure versus the solvent control. Figure 6. Gilly et al. 2012. Figure 6. Rationale and results for experiment to test whether the Waggle dance compounds reactivate experienced foragers to visit known food sources. Previous experiments described here had used feeder dishes filled with sugar water, left panel. Thus the observed increases in foraging were a product of both recruitment via Waggle dancing and reactivation of experienced foragers. Emptying the feeder dish eliminated recruitment to the source, yet dance compound exposure still increased the arrival of experienced foragers at the feeder dish, right panel. So it seems that these compounds, emitted by Waggle dancing bees, are not so much messages from the Waggle dancers to their dance followers, but to other bees in the hive for whom the existence of favorable foraging conditions is relevant. In retrospect, it makes sense that these volatile chemicals, as they diffuse throughout the dance floor area, carry a general broadcast message rather than a specific targeted message. Speaking bee by manipulating levels of a pheromone to provoke a behavioral response, have we communicated with the bees? Honeybees, as you know, are smart little things, but their sensory world is alien to our own, prohibiting communication of the kind we share with our domesticated mammalian cousins. If the conclusions of the experiment described above are correct, then we have in these investigations tapped into the scent-dominated sensory world of honeybee society. Improved tools for communicating with our bees could enhance our relationship with them, whether your beekeeping interests are as a hobbyist, honey producer, or agriculturalist. At present, this research suggests that we would do well to consider how our management practices could affect the finely tuned olfactory environment that bees craft within their hives. References by Smiger, J. C. and Seeley, T. D. 2005. The use of Waggle dance information by honeybees throughout their foraging careers. Behavioral Ecology and Sociobiology, 59-1, 133-142. Blomqvist, G. J. Chu, A. J. and Remerly, S. 1980. Biosynthesis of wax in the honeybee, Apis mellifera insect biochemistry, 10-3, 313-321. Frisch, K. V. 1967. Dance Language and Orientation of Bees. Harvard University Press, Cambridge. Gilly, D. C. DeGrande Hoffman, G. and Hooper, J. E. 2006. Volatile compounds emitted by live European honeybee, Apis mellifera L. Queen's.Journal of Insect Physiology, 50-5, 520-527. Gilly, D. C. Kuzara, J. M. and Tom, C. 2012. Hydrocarbons emitted by Waggle dancing honeybees stimulate colony foraging activity by causing experienced foragers to exploit known food sources. Apidology, 43-1, 8594. Gilly, D. C. 2014. Hydrocarbons emitted by Waggle dancing honeybees increase forager recruitment by stimulating dancing. Peelers 1, 9. Gruder, C. and Farina, W. M. 2009. The honeybee Waggle dance. Can we follow the steps? Trends in Ecology and Evolution, 24-5, 242-247. Howard, R. W. and Blomqvist, G. J. 1982. Chemical Ecology and Biochemistry of Insect Hydrocarbons. Annual Review of Entomology, 27-1, 149-172. Lingauer, M. 1971. Communication Among Social Bees, 2nd edition. Harvard University Press, Cambridge. Seeley T. D. 1995. The Wisdom of the Hive. The Social Physiology of Honeybee Colonies. Harvard University Press, Cambridge. Steinmetz, I. Schmalz, E. and Ruther, J. 2003. Cuticular lipids as trail pheromone in a social wasp. Proceedings of the Royal Society of London. Series B, Biological Sciences, 270 1513, 385 391. Tom C. and Doornhaus A. 2004. Preliminary report on the use of volatile compounds by foraging honeybees in the hive. Hymenoptera, Apidae, Apis mellifera. Entomologia Generalis Journal of General and Applied Entomology, 29 to 299. Tom C. Dewey D. C. Hooper J. and Esch H. E. 2007. The Scent of the Waggle Dance. PLO's Bio 59 E228.